hello everyone. It's been a little while. I'm very excited this morning as I'm doing a first in-person recording for quite some time, certainly over a year, I think, as lockdown restrictions have eased. So I jumped in the car and I'm going to do a couple of in-person recordings even during our summer break. When I started the podcast, I looked around me in the local area and we did an episode or a couple of episodes on education and technology in Hackney in East London. And now for the last 2 years, I've found myself in West Devon in the UK. And I'm really excited about uncovering a couple of the things that are happening down here as well. So the first interview I'm going to do and that you're going to hear from today is with the head of learning at Schumacher College. And why I'm interested in speaking to them is because they are very much a head, hand and heart sort of philosophy of learning. So very much kind of in person and also with a sort of ecological bent. So how do we think about our place in the world in relation to subjects like economics and others, which is something that I think is becoming more and more popular. But if you have that philosophy of sort of practical in-person community, how do you balance that with this new world of hybrid digital and online? So I'm interested to hear how they're tackling that. And then later on, I'm hoping to also record with the Real Ideas organisation based in Plymouth. And they're doing some really interesting things around access to digital careers and also becoming a sort of place of excellence for virtual reality. And so super excited to also chat to them. That's kind of what I'm doing at the moment. It's kind of what we've got coming up. And in the meantime, whilst we're on summer break, I have been busy working with Ian Hurd on building out a self-paced online course for how to launch a podcast, including your first episode. And then once that course is launched, we'll be doing another one on commercialising your podcast. So I've been kind of thinking quite deeply at the moment about this explosion or renaissance of audio as a learning medium. So we're seeing more and more of that with startups popping up around audio being an accessible micro-learning tool. But also podcasting obviously as a sort of more generic communication tool as well. So if any of that sounds of interest to you, we've got a pre-registration link, which I'll drop in the show notes for this episode. But otherwise, wherever you are, it's been a while. I'm recording this on my phone because I've managed in 10 minutes before the interview is about to take place to jam a memory card into my Zoom H6 so that I can't use that today. So apologies for the slightly alternative audio quality for this episode, but we'll be back up and running next time. And I just need to find a screwdriver to make that happen. So, who knows? It could even happen this time around. But yeah, wherever you are, I hope you're okay, doing well. And yeah, enjoy the episode. Bye-bye. So we're sat in the beautiful gardens of Dartington Hall. I'm here with Pavel Cenkl, who's the Director of Learning for Dartington Hall Trust, of which Schumacher College is sort of part of that family. So Pavel, just to kick off, perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for taking the time, Sophie. Really, really appreciate you coming here.
No, it's an absolute delight to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Hopefully the birds aren't too loud in the background, but it's just wonderful to be outside. So I've been at Dartington for about 18 months. I started in October of 2019, so a couple of months before COVID and before everything started up. So, and I started out as head of Schumacher College, which, as you said, is part of Dartington, and then evolved into also being the director of learning for the whole of the trust. And so what that means is, as we've been sort of evolving during COVID, during all of the lockdown, according to a strategic plan that was put in place right before I arrived, and still was continuing to evolve, developing from a handful of postgraduate programs at Schumacher College. For example, in 2019, we ran 2 postgraduate programs that were fully residential, ecological design thinking and economics for transition.
Yeah.
And we had about 25 students in total. Today we have over 100 students across 5 programs, across 2 separate colleges. And this coming year, we're looking at having a dozen different programs across those 2 schools. And so we have, since I arrived, developed the Dartington Art School, in which there was a Dartington College of Arts here up until 2010 or thereabouts. And this is a revitalization of the arts program.
Yeah.
And sort of really looking at the rich history of just about 100 years of experimentation and progressive engagement with arts and with ecology and with social justice. And so what we've done over the past year and a half really is to focus the Trust's mission on exactly that, to be a center for learning, really focusing on arts, ecology, and social justice and where those 3 areas might intersect. And so to do that, we've got a whole host of top programs. As I've said, we're starting out with a new undergraduate program in regenerative food and farming. And we've also shifted a lot of our delivery from fully residential, where students would stay for 6 months on end, to a low residency model, which is incredibly popular. We had record applications last year, and again, record applications this year. And I think, perhaps COVID is partly responsible for that, because, they are much more flexible to engage in, and students can have jobs, whilst they engage in really, immersive, embodied, experiential learning, and also have time away to be able to engage online with those courses. So the majority of our courses are low residency at the moment.
Yeah, it's very timely at the moment with G7 in Cornwall to think about all these topics. But I mean, why I was really excited to connect with you and come and talk to you is, so on the podcast, we've had this sort of acceleration of people using educational technology and getting to grips with online learning. And that's been both good and bad. So we've seen the worst excesses of that as well. And I think now there's this ambition to take the best parts of what we've learned, but add a more human-centred approach, shall we say, something that's a bit more collaborative, that adds in that sort of social-emotional learning aspect. And, as a college which talks a lot about sort of head, hand and heart and is, practical learning, and, we see a lot on the way in around, crafts and the arts that you've talked about. So I was really interested to say, if you have a college with that philosophy, how are you then grappling with maintaining that philosophy whilst also sort of using technology to scale? Or
I think there are a couple of different approaches. One, the low residency approach, which, in a non-COVID environment would allow students to come here for 2 weeks, typically 2 weeks, to have immersive residential learning and use this space and have those experiences. And then sort of the long tail of that is an additional 4 weeks for, let's say, a given module, where they would be off-site, online, and engaging with their own environments and applying some of the tools and skills they've learned whilst they were here. So that's one model that we're working with. The other, which we're actually piloting a bit in a new master's program that's starting on the 21st of June, so quite soon, that I've been developing, the Movement, Mind, and Ecology master's program, where we have a cohort of 12 students in the program, half of whom are here on site and half of whom are online, simply because of COVID travel restrictions and inability to actually be here. So we have students in New Zealand, Nepal, India, and elsewhere, where some of those are sort of red-listed countries and they can't travel. So what we're developing there is the same experiential, and I love that you focused on the head, heart, and hands model that Satish Kumar has written quite a bit about, the founder of Schumacher College, and we've really taken that to be the heart and soul of what we do across Dartington. How do you translate that intersection of intellectual, affective, and embodied practice, really those 3 pieces. And so what we're finding is, we have, for example, an alumni network of about 20,000 around the world, and we have had historically a really large international contingent come through the college. So we have these wonderful nodes of a network that are in all of the places that we're connecting our students with. And I'll give you an example. I was just on 3 or 4 calls this week. One with an organization called Efecto Mariposa in Colombia, one with a recent alumna in Peru who's developing an eco-village there, and one coming up with Escola Schumacher in Brazil, and one with a group in Tanzania and South Africa, and sort of thinking about how we can capitalize on this network of people who are doing exciting and amazing things, which are the embodiment of the Schumacher and Dartington practice, and connect them with the students who are already in those sites. Right. So, for example, our student in Nepal, we're able to connect with practitioners in Nepal who are doing the types of things that he might be interested in doing. So, if he's online with us, largely in an asynchronous mode, right? I think we've all learned that nobody wants to sit in Zoom lectures forever.
Yeah.
So particularly with time zone challenges as well, we have a lot of material that can be accessed, asynchronously and doing sort of non-live chats and message boards and that sort of thing. But then to have the ability to engage in experiential learning where they are, on sites with facilitators who are there. So it's really kind of what I've been calling a global distributed learning network that is grounded here, but allows students access in different places in the world.
It's almost like the measure of success if those nodes go out and become successful in their own right, and it doesn't have to be something that's sort of centred here in Devon, that you have to be physically present, but you can take those values and run with them, kind of thing.
Exactly. For me, it's a bit about access as well, right? That can we make, because it's challenging for someone to come from all the way around on the other side of the world, to travel to Devon, to devote half a year to be in residence, or even if it's a low residency program, what are the logistics of traveling that distance to be here for 2 weeks and then not for 4 and then back and forth. So we're experimenting with various opportunities of access for those students. So I think we were going there anyway. And I think you've probably heard this from a lot of people that COVID has pushed us much faster down a road we were already going on.
Yeah.
And in terms of just using technology, in delivering higher education, and I think particularly in a place like Schumacher, which was so built on being in place and having the experience. The feedback that we've gotten over the last year from students and from teaching staff is that, if we, in a number of courses, that online actually is really effective. And in fact, maybe having 4 sets of 2-week residential periods might be too much for some people. And so is there a way to actually hold community, maybe having fewer of those? I don't think that works universally for every program, but I think for some of them, that might really be the way to go. So from my perspective, as we were headed down this road already, and I've been sort of thinking about and exploring ideas of delivering experiential learning online at a distance, for quite a while, then I think that's where I'd like to see us to get to, where we're running effectively parallel, potentially, courses that are low residency, that are online, that intersect really meaningfully, and that have this sense of both learning community and the experience that is at the heart of what we do.
And would you ever play around with enrollment dates and that kind of thing, or is that integral to building that community and that cohort?
No, we are playing around with enrollment dates. Okay. Yeah, I mean, right now we actually have 4 different start dates for our programs. April, June, September, and January, and we are offering all of our modules, so discrete modules, 2 to 6 weeks, as independent learning experiences for those who are interested. And we have quite a bit of take-up on those, and some are quite popular. They're particularly design in society, or reframing economic thinking, or something along those lines. People would come in or stay online and engage in those learning experiences. I think that enhances the community of longer-term students that are already here. If you've got a cohort of 18 master students and suddenly you get 15 people coming in from industry to take that module, can you imagine the conversations? That's absolutely fantastic.
That's really interesting, because I know that previously people have talked about, will higher education become a sort of subscription? Will it become something where, you kind of buy into whatever the university institutional brand is, what they stand for, and then, you may go to a library, you may go to a cafe that's sort of sponsored by them in some way, and it becomes like this free-flowing thing that's not defined by the traditional estate. So when you talked about your student in Nepal or in Tanzania, it's quite interesting sort of thinking about building that community and that Schumacher philosophy internationally. So will that become a sort of formalised thing, or will it become sort of more like that community of learners and alumni that you talked about?
I think it'll be both. Part of it, I think, does need to be formalized because you are delivering, a program, and you're delivering, say, a module. So if we had a module, let's say in movement practice, and we had students that are interested in, Colombia and Peru and South Africa and elsewhere who wanted to take part in that module, we would absolutely connect them with facilitators there, bring them on board for this module, but it would still be a discrete learning experience. And then the projects that they would do and the relationships that they would build and the network that comes out of that would spill out the edges. So that would, I think, really enhance that experience. I've said somewhere elsewhere that, and I think we're all coming to realize this, that the undergraduate and graduate degree certificate is not the be-all, end-all of education. And that it absolutely plays a role, but we're exploding that and finding, micro-credential routes, alternate credentialing and badges that employers actually see as being particularly useful to identify, certain skill sets that people might have, that students come in and say, I want to learn this particular set of skills. And in fact, I see that you're offering 40 different modules. Can I take, X, Y, and Z modules and create my own bespoke pathway? So those are things we're just at the beginning of exploring.
Yeah, I think the whole assessment thing's really interesting, how that, it's ripe for overhaul, isn't it, I think?
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And are there any other sort of applications of technology you can see that would be part of your sort of learning strategy?
Well, and it's always an interesting question. And I've got a meeting right after this conversation, actually, with the program lead in movement-mind ecology and our full-time learning technologist here on the estate, thinking about exactly what tech we're going to be using in that particular program, because it's movement-based. So how do we capture some of that movement practice through technology, or how can we share some of those experiences? I led a series of workshops last year as we were coming into September of 2020, and looking at starting new programs that were necessarily going to have to be online largely. So workshops with faculty about, what are the tools that we might use, and we looked across the, really the panoply of the thousands of apps that are out there. And it really became clear that it's not about the technology specifically. It's not about that there's no killer app that's going to solve this challenge.
No.
And I've actually written somewhere that once we start calling education virtual, then we've completely lost, because it's always real, it's always tangible, and it can't be at a remove of a piece of technology. I mean, that said, we do use message boards and use sharing platforms where we can share videos and photos and experiences. We do use a fair bit of video lecture capture and archiving and all of that sort of stuff. So I think we're fairly well positioned in terms of the tech we use, but it's how we use it and how we actually sort of privilege the student experience over the online engagement.
And I like that piece that you talked about earlier about access as well. So potentially, allowing more people to access this kind of philosophy of learning as well.
Exactly.
And then the other thing that I was interested to talk to you about was, we hear more and more about sort of education being more sort of project-based and mission-led, and that's something that Schumacher College has been doing sort of since its inception, really. So I wondered how you're seeing that evolve to become a more mainstream thing,
Well, I mean, just to say at first that you're right. A lot of our education is grounded in the application of, learned skills and knowledge. And, I'll use this course coming up as an example. It's built on, partnerships that then the students can work with individual partners around the world to develop their own agendas in their dissertation projects or in developing a movement practice that they're then going to pass on to community groups and facilitation and that sort of thing. And many of our programs do exactly that sort of thing. We have a program that's running right now called Arts in Place, where the students were here on site for 6 weeks. This is part of the Arts College. And for the following 10 weeks or so, they're moving around to different arts residencies at different organizations across the UK. And so that's, again, a distributed learning model where they have an immersive experience for, let's say, a week. And then they come back at the end and share those in the project.
Yeah, which is great because I've got in my mind a sort of coding boot camp, and the pushback often is they're quite sort of city-centric, so it's nice to hear of things that are sort of spreading out a bit beyond. Yeah, I guess that was another take on it, is like, I put here, the pandemic has accelerated the trend of remote working and remote learning and challenged our assumption that everything important has to happen in the megacities. Yeah. How will this impact what happens in places like Schumacher? So are you seeing more people become interested as a result of almost like a reversal of what I just spoke about, that everything has to happen in the cities?
Well, I think so. And I think it actually has historically been that. That we have offered, and we're celebrating our 30th anniversary of the college. We've just published a book, called Transformative Learning. So people come here for a transformative experience. And just interestingly, people, incoming students often ask me, so who's your typical student? Am I going to be out of place? I say there absolutely is no typical student, that comes to Dartington. But if I was to try to hone in on one, it would be somebody who, might be, late 20s, early 30s, who has had experience out in the workforce and has kind of seen some of the challenges and perhaps is hitting some blocks in terms of being able to develop networks, being able to integrate ecological systems thinking into the work that they're doing, and really wants that experience from here that they can go and reskill and bring back to whatever they're doing. So this has been historically, and I think continues to be, a place for exactly that sort of purpose. What we're seeing in terms of not being London-centric, from my perspective, everybody from London seems to want to move to South Devon right now. As somebody who's trying to find trying to move house and find another place to live, it's almost impossible. And our students are finding the same challenges. So there's no lack of people coming here to find whatever experience, whether they're able to remote work, in businesses that are more urban and living out here in this beautiful environment. But I think there's something. There's still a next step there somewhere, which I think we haven't quite, lived into or tapped into, which is how to sort of integrate that remote working cohort into some of our learning experiences. Because they're already networked in to organizations that aren't here. So how can we kind of tap into and actually enhance our learning opportunities with that group of sort of newly arrived residents here?
I had a few rapid fire questions, which if you're up for them. Where were you born?
I was born outside of Boston in Massachusetts in the States.
I like Boston. Tell us what your school life was like.
I mean, I think I'd have to go beyond, primary school and into some of the, secondary school experiences where, I was able to tap into very outdoors-oriented groups and not do sort of the standards, physical education classes, and then, go on rock climbing and go on hiking trips.
Do you do a lot of running, if I remember correctly?
I do a lot of running, yes.
Okay, yeah. So that stayed with you?
That has actually developed later in life. I was much more, a hiker and, going on mountain walks and that sort of thing. But only in my late 20s, early 30s did I start taking running long distances more seriously. And that has turned into quite a passion of mine.
Oh, you should probably tell me all about your hundreds of miles in the Arctic and subarctic.
we always come around to that, don't we?
There's not something that most guests can really kind of expound on. So
so I think it was probably in 2013 or 2014, I had this idea, having been doing endurance running for quite some time already, And having begun to teach courses in environmental humanities and thinking about how ecology, humanities, philosophy, sort of environmental thinking broadly intersect with one another. And then I had this massive movement practice on the side. I thought, how do I connect these things? And so I developed this project called Climate Run, which has its own online presence, and started running across large areas of the Arctic and subarctic. So I started out by running across Iceland, from the south coast to the north coast over 3 days, 1 year, and then running all of the highest peaks in the Faroe Islands, and going up to Svalbard and doing some running there, and running across Arctic Scandinavia, all with an eye toward effectively witnessing climate change and the impact of glacial melt and post-glacial rebound of the Earth's crust, and sort of the impacts that was having conversations with people from indigenous Sami communities in Norway and Sweden, for example, and how climate change might be impacting them. And really having sort of this firsthand, often quite miserable experience of running through landscapes that were more flooded and more in a different state than I had expected them to be. But really sort of fantastic experiences that brought me to the point of of understanding vulnerability of the human in the more than human world in ways that I had never understood before. And so I used those experiences and sort of leveraged the real appeal of looking at beautiful pictures and listening to great stories of adventure, and was able to give quite a number of talks and presentations to people that really focused on this moment of how can you use the experience of being vulnerable in the world to then build a more resilient relationship between the human and the more than human, and thus understand, perhaps on a more visceral, embodied level, our relationship to climate change, which sometimes is a big nebulous thing out there. And I think that's been really successful. And as a result of that, I began teaching a series of courses in applications of environmental philosophy, for example. How do you take this thinking and embody it in practice? And that has actually led to the Movement Mind Ecology Master's Program that we're running now.
Yeah.
And that's kind of come to, can we really explore that alive space between the human and the more than human? And once we think about that as being the center of everything, right, how does that change our discussion, change our relationship with the world, with one another, and so on?
And how do you define the more than human?
Well, I use that term very specifically because very often people say, it's human in nature, or humans in the environment, or humans in the landscape, or humans in the non-human. And for me, it's recognizing that the world around us is more than us.
Right.
And that we are part of this broader system. It's perhaps more a nod to the systems approach.
Yeah, so taking us out of being the center of that.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's what's often called in philosophy a post-human approach, where if you take your lens and humans are not at the center of the world, then all of a sudden that changes virtually everything.
Yeah, I suppose I'll put here, what is your big idea?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got so many, right? But right in the context of this conversation and the context of developing curriculum, right? I do consider myself sort of a curriculum designer. So when we're thinking about, how can we, going back to what we talked about, how can we create more accessible learning to a greater diversity of participants that carries with it this sense of embodied experiential practice, right? So I'm absolutely believe that experiential hands-on learning, is fundamental at both the undergraduate and postgraduate level to, building a set of skills, building communities of learners that then go on and do wonderful things in the world, which is what we want. Right? And so, what I'm working on now is as we talked about, we're piloting in the course this summer, and looking at how we integrate that into some of our other postgraduate and undergraduate programs, how we make the modules in those courses accessible both online and in person, so that we can increase access and really sort of capitalize on a diversity of experiences rather than just a singular experience in place.
And then finally, is there anyone else that you would recommend on the podcast that you kind of think, wow, I really like what they do?
Have you talked to Brian Alexander?
I think I've spoken to him in my previous job. Long hair.
Yeah, long hair, big beard.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
Absolutely brilliant.
Okay, he'd be a good person to get on there.
Yep. I mean, his book that came out last year or the year before about the future of higher education, that talked about what if there was a pandemic, what would we do?
Oh, really? Wow.
Just struck me as being incredibly prescient and forward-thinking.
Yeah.
And his blog, I do go to his blog quite frequently.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's a good recommendation. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time, and it was great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, thank you.